The sun in that part of the West was not a giver of life, but a taker of it. It was a hammer of brass, beating down on an anvil of cracked, thirsty earth, the land, stretching to a horizon that shimmered with heat and lies, offered nothing but sagebrush, scorpion, and stone. It was a country that promised a man freedom and gave him solitude, a place where God seemed to have turned his back after a brief and violent act of creation. And it was here, a mile or so from the dusty, self-righteous town of Redemption, that the encampment known as the Plague Sisters clung to existence. It was not a settlement. Not really. It was a scar on the land, a collection of ramshackle tents and lean-tos cobbled together from scavenged timber, fraying canvas, and hope that had long since turned to rot. The wind, a constant, sighing mourner, swept through the makeshift alleys, carrying dust and the faint, bitter scent of herbal remedies. It whipped at the patched-up skirts of the women who dwelled within, women who moved like ghosts in their own lives. The people of Redemption had many names for the place. They called it the Scourge, the Pox Patch, or simply, Out There. Decent folk spoke of it in whispers. A place where wives who had lost their husbands to fever, cholera, or a bullet were sent, where daughters with no dowry and a stain on their name were abandoned, where orphans with no one to claim them were dumped like unwanted baggage. The prevailing belief, spoken aloud in the saloon and preached quietly from the pulpit, was that the women carried a sickness, if not of the body, then of the soul. They were considered unclean, unlucky, a moral blight that had to be kept at a distance, lest their misfortune prove contagious. The men of Redemption might get drunk and tell tall tales of sneaking out there on a moonless night, but none ever did. It was a place of ghosts, and no man wanted to be haunted by that kind of sorrow. Far from both the town and the camp, where the foothills began their slow, rugged climb into the mountains, stood the skeleton of a ranch. Its bones were a dilapidated cabin and a collapsing barn, surrounded by acres of land that had long forgotten the touch of a plow. This was Caleb's kingdom of dust and silence. Caleb was a tall man, built with the broad shoulders and long limbs of someone meant for hard work, but a permanent stoop, a slight curve in his spine, made him seem as if he were perpetually bracing against a blow. His face was a map of hard country and harder memories, tanned by the sun and etched with lines that spoke less of age and more of weariness. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held the flat, distant look of a man who had seen too much and felt too little since, years ago, he had worn the gray of the Confederacy, a ghost of a cause that had left him with a limp in his right leg and a hollowness in his chest that no amount of whiskey or solitude could fill. When the war ended, he drifted west, seeking not a new life, but an absence of the old one. He bought the ruined ranch for a pittance and set about the task of being forgotten. For 5 years, he had spoken to almost no one. His interactions were limited to the silent, grim-faced clerk at the general store in Redemption, where he rode once a season to trade a few pelts for flour, salt, and cartridges. He spoke to his horse more than he spoke to any man, and even those were just low, guttural commands. The silence of his ranch was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through the chinks in his cabin walls and the frantic beating of his own heart during the long, sweat-soaked nights when the ghosts of Shiloh and Gettysburg came to visit. He was a man living in the aftermath, a relic in a world that was trying its best to move on. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, Caleb was riding back from a week-long trapping expedition in the high country. His pack-horse was laden with beaver and fox pelts. As he crossed the main trade route that led to Redemption, his eye caught a flicker of white against the dun-colored earth. It was a piece of paper, folded and dirty, snagged on a stubborn sprig of sagebrush. It had likely fallen from a passing merchant's wagon. Curiosity, a feeling so long dormant in him he barely recognized it, made him halt his horse. He dismounted, his bad leg complaining with a familiar ache, and picked it up. The paper was cheap, the handwriting within elegant but shaky, as if written by a hand that knew both refinement and terror. It was not addressed to anyone, but its purpose was clear. It was a plea, a desperate gamble cast into the wind. Asterisk to the man who finds this. It began, asterisk, I write this not with hope, but for lack of any other recourse. My name is not of consequence, for it is a name that has been stripped of its dignity. I reside in the women's camp outside the town of Redemption. I am healthy of body, able in my work, and of sound mind. I am 24 years of age. Asterisk, I offer myself in marriage to any man of decent character who would be willing to take me from this place. I ask for no affection, no fortune, only for a roof that does not leak and a life that is not lived under the shadow of scorn. I will be a dutiful wife. I will cook and clean and mend, and I will keep a quiet home. I will ask for nothing more than the freedom that a married name provides. Asterisk, if this proposal finds a willing heart, leave a sign, a white cloth tied to the easternmost post of the cattle fence, a half-mile north of the camp. I will see it. I will find a way to meet. Caleb read it twice. His first reaction was a cold, empty sort of pity. A mail-order bride, not from the catalogs that circulated in the East, but from the local leper colony. It was the plea of a caged animal gnawing off its own foot to escape a trap. He crumpled the paper in his fist, the coarse texture rough against his calloused skin. It was not his concern. The world was full of suffering. He had seen enough of it to fill 1,000 lifetimes. He had built his walls high and thick for a reason. He shoved the crumpled note into his saddlebag, intending to use it for kindling later, and rode on, the silence of his life settling back around him like a shroud. A week later, his supplies ran low. The sack of flour was nearly empty, and he was out of coffee, a small luxury that made the cold mornings bearable. With a heavy sigh, he saddled his horse and made the long ride into Redemption. The town was as he always remembered it, a single dusty street flanked by false-fronted buildings, all of them looking tired and peeling under the relentless sun. Men loitered on the boardwalk outside the saloon, their voices a low drone of gossip and boasts. Women in bonnets and starched dresses hurried past, their eyes cast down, clutching their shopping baskets as if protecting them from the town's inherent grime. Caleb tied his horse in front of the general store, his movements stiff and deliberate. As he swung his bad leg over the saddle, a commotion from the far end of the street drew his attention. A small group of women, maybe 4 or 5, were walking from the communal well, carrying heavy wooden buckets of water. They were gaunt figures, dressed in faded calico dresses patched so many times the original fabric was impossible to discern. Their heads were covered with thin shawls to ward off the sun, and they walked close together, a small, tight knot of solidarity in a world that wanted them apart. They were from the camp, the Plague Sisters. A few of the men outside the saloon had noticed them too. A sneer spread across the face of a portly man with a sweat-stained hat. "Looky here," he drawled, loud enough for half the street to hear. "The ghouls are out for a drink." His companion snickered. Another man, younger and bolder, picked up a small pebble from the street. He tossed it, and it landed in the dust just short of the women's feet. They flinched but did not stop, their pace quickening slightly. Their eyes were fixed on the path ahead, their faces blank masks of grim endurance. "Hey now, don't you be shy," the young man called out, his voice thick with mockery. "We just want to say hello. Is the plague treating you well today?" He threw another stone. This one struck one of the buckets, producing a dull thud. A little water sloshed over the side. The women kept walking, a silent, desperate procession. Caleb stood by his horse, his hand resting on the worn leather of his saddle. He didn't move. He didn't speak. A part of him, the part that had survived the war by learning to mind his own business, told him to turn away, to go inside the store and get what he came for. This was the town's business. It was their cruelty, not his. He had no stake in it. He had fought in one war. He had no intention of starting another over a handful of pathetic women. But his feet remained planted in the dust. His eyes stayed on the scene. A third man, emboldened by the lack of reaction, stepped off the boardwalk. He was lanky and had a mean, pinched face. He swaggered toward the women, a cruel grin on his lips. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" he taunted. Getting closer. Or is it the rot? He reached out and gave the smallest of the women a hard shove. She was not expecting it. Thrown off balance by the weight of the water buckets, she stumbled, her ankle twisting beneath her. She cried out, a small, sharp sound of pain and surprise, and went down in a heap. The buckets crashed to the ground, spilling their precious contents into the thirsty dust. The other women froze for a second, their faces a mixture of fear and fury, before rushing to help their fallen companion. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He saw it all in stark, searing detail. The dark, spreading stain of the water in the dirt, the splintered wood of the broken bucket, the woman on the ground, pushing herself up on one elbow. Her shawl had fallen back, revealing a face pale with dust and exhaustion. Her hair, a dark chestnut brown, had come loose from its pins and clung to her cheek, but it was her eyes that held him. They were wide and the color of moss after a rain. And, in their depths, he saw two things warring with each other so fiercely it was like watching a storm break. He saw a raw, bottomless desperation, the look of an animal caught in a snare, but beneath it, burning with a cold, hard light, was a pride that refused to be extinguished. It was a defiant, unbroken pride that stared right through her tormentor, right through the whole jeering town, and declared that even here, in the dirt, she was still somebody. She was not a disease, she was a human being. The man who had pushed her just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He turned back to his friends, preening for their approval. "Clumsy, ain't they?" Caleb's hand, of its own accord, tightened into a fist. Something inside him, a rusty, frozen gear, ground into motion. It was not heroism, it was not righteousness. It was a gut-deep tremor of recognition. He knew that look. He had seen it in the eyes of dying soldiers who refused to cry out, in men who had lost everything but still held on to some small, sacred piece of themselves. He saw in her eyes the same desolation he felt in his own soul. He did not move. He did not say a word. The townsmen eventually grew bored and ambled back to the saloon. The women helped their friend to her feet. She was limping, favoring one ankle, but she held her head high. Without a backward glance, they retrieved the remaining buckets and continued their long walk back to the camp, disappearing into the heat haze like an apparition. Caleb stood there for a long time, the dust settling around him. The image of the woman's eyes was burned into his mind. He no longer saw a plague sister. He saw a woman named Lenora. He didn't know how he knew her name. Perhaps it was just a name the wind whispered to him, and he felt his own carefully constructed solitude begin to crack. That night, he didn't use the crumpled letter for kindling. He smoothed it out by the light of his lantern and read it again, the shaky, elegant script no longer seeming pathetic, but brave. For 3 days, the memory of the woman's eyes was a constant, unwelcome guest in Caleb's solitude. It was there when he awoke to the cold, gray light of dawn, and it was there when he sat by his fire at night, the flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to take her shape. The carefully constructed peace of his isolation was shattered. He had come west to outrun his ghosts, but he had not counted on finding a new one in the flesh. Her look of defiant despair had touched a part of him he thought had died on the battlefields of Tennessee, the part that could still feel the sharp edge of another's pain. The crumpled letter in his saddlebag felt heavier than a stone. It was a testament to a life as broken as his own, a desperate hand reaching out from the depths. To ignore it now felt like a different kind of cruelty, a passive cowardice he couldn't stomach. He had stood by and done nothing in town. He could not do so again. On the 4th morning, he made a decision. The act itself felt foreign. like trying to use a limb that had long since atrophied. He found a piece of charcoal from the fire pit and a scrap of wrapping paper he had saved, dipping the charcoal in water to make it right. His large, clumsy fingers struggled to form the letters. He wasn't a man of words, and the ones he wrote were as sparse and stark as the landscape around him. He did not sign his name. He did not offer pleasantries. He simply wrote, "Asterisk, I found your letter. I am the man who will marry you, if the offer still stands. I wish to speak with you. If you agree, be at the abandoned stable north of the creek at sundown tomorrow." He folded the note, his heart hammering against his ribs with a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. He rode out that afternoon, not towards town, but on a wide, circuitous route that brought him to the northern perimeter of the lands bordering the camp. He found the cattle fence mentioned in her letter, a sad, sagging line of wire and wood. From his saddlebag, he pulled a strip of white linen torn from an old shirt. With stiff fingers, he tied it to the easternmost post. It fluttered in the wind, a small, lonely flag of surrender to a feeling he did not understand. He left the signal and rode away without looking back, the note for her tucked safely in his pocket, ready for their first meeting. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Inside the camp, the world was a circle of quiet desperation. The days were marked by the sun's passage and the gnawing ache of hunger. Lenora's ankle was bruised and swollen from her fall in town, a painful, physical reminder of their station in the world. She sat with Martha, an older woman whose face was a roadmap of disappointments, mending a tattered blanket. "You see that?" a younger girl named Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she pointed a thin finger towards the north. "On the fence post." Lenora and Martha looked up. A mile distant, a tiny speck of white danced in the wind. It was unmistakable. Martha squinted. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "A trick," she rasped, her voice dry as dust. "Some of those devils from town, looking for a cruel laugh. But who would bother?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with a naive hope that had not yet been fully beaten out of her. "What if it's real?" Lenora's heart began to beat a frantic, painful rhythm. She had written that letter weeks ago, in a moment of absolute despair, and had given it to a kind-faced merchant who promised to lose it on the road outside of town. She had never truly expected a reply. The hope was too dangerous a thing to nurture. "It's a trap, child," Martha said, turning back to her mending. "Best you forget you ever saw it. Hope is a poison in a place like this. It makes the end harder to bear." But Lenora couldn't forget it. The white cloth was a question mark hanging on the horizon. A trick? Probably. A path to something worse than what she already had? Entirely possible. But it was also the first and only glimmer of a different life she had seen in the 3 years since her family had cast her out. Penniless and disgraced, after her fiancé was killed in a mining accident, leaving her with nothing but his broken promises. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay on her thin straw pallet, listening to the chorus of coughs and quiet sobs that was the camp's nightly song. Martha's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk hope is a poison. But what was the alternative? A slow, withering death from hunger, sickness, or sheer despair. She thought of her fall in town, of the jeering faces and the sting of humiliation. She thought of the man who had pushed her. She could not live the rest of her life as an object of sport for cruel men. Before dawn, while the others slept, she slipped out of the tent. Her ankle throbbed with every step, but she ignored the pain. She had to know. She made her way to the fence post, moving like a wraith through the pre-dawn gloom. The white cloth was real, soft beneath her trembling fingers, and tied to the post with a piece of twine was a folded piece of paper. Her hands shook so badly she could barely open it. She read the stark, simple words under the rising sun, her breath catching in her throat. Asterisk, I am the man who will marry you. It was not a prank. The words were too direct, too serious. This was something else. She looked around at the vast, empty landscape. Who was he? An old man, a desperate fool, a monster who preyed on helpless women? There was no way to know, but he was offering a door. She did not know what lay on the other side, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that she had to turn the knob. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The abandoned stable smelled of decay, of rotting hay, and the ghosts of long-dead animals. The last rays of sunlight bled through the cracks in the walls, striping the dusty air with bars of gold and shadow. Lenora stood in the deepest of those shadows, her back pressed against the rough-hewn wood, her hand clutching a sharpened piece of rock she had picked up on her way. She had told Martha she was going to search for medicinal herbs. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She heard him before she saw him, the soft, rhythmic fall of a horse's hooves, one slightly heavier than the other. A man with a limp. The sound stopped outside. A moment of silence passed that stretched for an eternity. And then the large stable door creaked open. He was silhouetted against the dying light, a figure of immense size and stillness. He stepped inside, and the door swung halfway shut behind him, plunging the stable into deeper gloom. Lenora's heart hammered against her ribs. She could make out his shape now. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the simple, durable clothes of a rancher or a drifter. He moved slowly, deliberately, his limp more pronounced on the uneven dirt floor. He stopped in the center of the stable, his eyes scanning the shadows. "I'm here," Lenora said, her voice coming out as a reedy whisper she barely recognized as her own. He turned his head slowly towards the sound. He didn't seem startled. He simply waited, swallowing hard. She forced herself to step out of the shadows into a weak beam of light. His face was hard, weathered, and unsmiling. His eyes, a startlingly pale blue, seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. There was a deep, settled sadness in them that she recognized immediately, a quiet kinship of sorrow. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, but he carried himself like an old man. He just stood there, watching her, his silence more unnerving than any threat. He didn't speak, he didn't move closer, he just looked at her, his gaze steady and intense. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. It was a test. She realized she had to be the one to speak. "It was you?" she asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "You left the note?" He gave a single curt nod. "Why?" The word hung in the air between them. Asterisk. Why would any man seek a wife from the boneyard? He seemed to consider the question for a long moment. "I need a wife," he said finally, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, unused to conversation. "You need a husband." It was so simple, so devoid of emotion. It was jarring, a transaction, a contract. She took a half step back, her defensiveness rising. "You think you can just buy me, pay for my freedom with a wedding ring?" "No," he said, and for the first time, a flicker of something, frustration, perhaps, crossed his face. "That's not it." He fell silent again, struggling for words. The tension in the stable was thick enough to choke on. Lenora clutched the sharpened rock in her hand, her knuckles white. He was a stranger, a giant of a man with haunted eyes, and she was alone with him in a derelict building. The full weight of her recklessness crashed down on her. "Aren't you afraid?" she blurted out, the question a mix of genuine curiosity and a desperate attempt to fill the oppressive silence. "To come here, to seek someone like me? They say we carry sickness. They say we're cursed." He looked at her, and his gaze was so direct, so unflinching, that she felt he was looking not at her, but straight through her, into the darkest corners of her own fear. "I survived the war," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any heroism. "I watched boys die screaming for their mothers in muddy fields. I've seen things that would make a devil weep. What's left to be afraid of?" The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. In that one stark confession, she understood. He wasn't fearless. He was hollowed out. The world had already done its worst to him, and he had walked out the other side. He wasn't afraid of the camp's reputation because he was already living in his own kind of hell. The fear drained out of her, replaced by a strange, aching wave of empathy. The rock in her hand suddenly felt heavy and foolish. She let it drop silently into the dust. They met again 2 nights later, in the same place. This time, Caleb brought a bundle wrapped in cloth. He didn't say a word, just held it out to her. Inside was a loaf of freshly baked bread, still slightly warm, a small tin of salve for her ankle, and a thick wool blanket. Lenora stared at the items, her throat tightening. It had been years since anyone had given her a gift, years since anyone had shown her a kindness that wasn't tinged with pity. The bread was not a romantic token, it was life. The salve was not a gesture of affection, it was a practical remedy for a real wound. He understood what she needed, not what a suitor was supposed to offer. Their third meeting happened a week after that. The air was colder, with the first hint of autumn in the wind. He was waiting for her when she arrived. This time, he spoke first. "I have a ranch," he said, his eyes fixed on some point over her shoulder. "It's not much, needs work, but it's quiet. No one will bother you there." He looked at her then, his pale eyes meeting hers. He seemed to brace himself. "Be my wife, Lenora." He said her name. He must have heard it in town that day. The sound of it on his lips was both strange and wonderful. "It's not because I pity you," he went on, his voice low and earnest, as if forcing the words out was a physical effort. "And it's not charity. The silence, it's too loud out there. I want you there. Asterisk, I want you. Not asterisk, I need a cook asterisk. Not asterisk, I need a housekeeper asterisk. Asterisk, I want you." 3 words that no one had said to her in a lifetime. She hesitated, the enormity of the decision pressing down on her. To leave the familiar misery of the camp for the unknown loneliness of this man's life. To trade a cage she knew for one she did not. She looked at his face, at the deep-seated pain in his eyes that mirrored her own. He was broken, just as she was. Perhaps 2 broken things, she thought, could make a whole. Perhaps they could stand together, each holding up the other's fractured pieces. Martha's warning came back to her. Asterisk hope is a poison. But for the first time, Lenora felt it wasn't hope she was feeling. It was a choice, a chance to stop being a victim of fate and to take a deliberate step, even if it was into darkness. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible over the sighing of the wind. "I will." A flicker of relief, so faint she almost missed it, passed through his eyes. He gave another of his short, sharp nods. "Good," he said. "We'll need to be careful. Get you out of there without the town knowing who you are or where you came from. It has to be a secret. For now." She nodded in agreement. A secret. Their lives would begin as a secret. 2 ghosts slipping away in the night, hoping to find a resurrection in each other. Leaving was a kind of death. Lenora had to tear herself away from the only community she had known for 3 years, a fellowship forged in shared misery. She told no one of Caleb's offer, only that she had found a position as a housekeeper for a reclusive widower far to the north. It was a plausible lie, a fragile shield against the questions and the complex tapestry of reactions she knew would come. She said her goodbyes under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Just before the moon rose, she went to Martha first, finding the older woman sitting outside their tent, staring into the gathering dark. "So," Martha said, not looking at her, "the little bird is flying the coop." "I have to, Martha," Lenora said softly, her voice catching. Martha finally turned, her eyes deep-set and full of a sad, weary wisdom. "I hope you know what you're doing, girl. The world outside this camp, it ain't kind to our sort. Men promise you a roof and give you a cage. Be careful whose key you accept." It was the closest the cynical woman could come to expressing her fear, her affection. She pressed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle into Lenora's hand. "For your journey, dried herbs, good for fever and a sore heart." Sarah, the young girl, clung to her, her eyes shining with unshed tears and vicarious hope. "You're really leaving? You're going to be free?" For Sarah, Lenora's departure was a fairy tale come to life, a testament that the walls of their world were not insurmountable. "Don't forget us," she whispered, pressing a small, smooth river stone into Lenora's palm. Others were not so kind. A woman named Agnes, whose face was pinched with perpetual envy, watched from a distance with narrowed eyes. "Think she's too good for us now?" she muttered to another woman, just loud enough for Lenora to hear. "She'll be back. They always come back, one way or another." The words were like small, sharp stones, and Lenora flinched from their impact. She left with nothing but the patched dress on her back, Martha's herbs, Sarah's stone, and a heart that was a tangled knot of terror and elation. She met Caleb at the abandoned stable as planned. He had brought a second horse, a gentle-eyed mare. He said nothing of her red-rimmed eyes or the trembling of her hands. He simply helped her into the saddle, his touch on her arm firm and impersonal. And they rode away from the camp, two shadows moving against the vast, indifferent canvas of the night. The ride to his ranch was a long, silent journey through a landscape of dark, sleeping hills and silvered plains. The silence between them was not awkward, but vast and profound, as if they were both conserving their words for a life that had not yet begun. When they finally arrived, the moon was high and cold, casting the cabin and barn in stark relief. It was exactly as he'd described it. Not much. The cabin was a simple, sturdy box of logs, chinked with mud that had crumbled in places. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were dark, empty eyes. Yet, there was a stillness to the place, a deep and abiding quiet that was nothing like the tense, watchful silence of the camp. This was the quiet of solitude, not of imprisonment. Caleb dismounted and helped her down. The door creaked open under his hand, revealing a single room steeped in darkness. He moved inside with a familiar economy of motion, striking a match. The sudden flare of light revealed a space that was Spartan and neglected. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean but cold. There was a rough-hewn table with one chair, a few shelves holding tins and sacks of flour, and in the corner, a narrow cot. The air was thick with the scent of dust, old wood, and the faint, masculine smell of leather and smoke. And against the far wall, there was a second bed. It was a proper bed, with a sturdy wooden frame and what looked like a real mattress stuffed with corn husks, not straw. It was covered with a clean, if threadbare, blanket. He had made it for her. The realization struck Lenora with a force that made her knees weak. This silent, brooding man had gone to the trouble of building a bed for her. He gestured towards it with a nod. "That's yours," he said, then turned to build a fire in the hearth as if the matter were settled. That first night, Lenora experienced a series of bewildering firsts. For the first time in 3 years, she slept on a mattress that cushioned her weary bones instead of poking them. The comfort was so alien it was almost painful, and she lay awake for hours, simply absorbing the sensation. For the first time, she ate until she was truly full. A simple meal of beans and bacon that Caleb cooked in a cast-iron skillet over the fire. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, her stomach aching with the unaccustomed bounty. But the most profound and unsettling freedom was this. For the first time in 1,000 days, she was not being watched by 100 pairs of eyes judging her, pitying her, or envying her. Caleb moved about the small cabin with a quiet purposefulness, paying her little mind. His lack of attention was the greatest gift he could have given her. It allowed her to simply be. It allowed her to breathe. She found herself unclenching muscles she didn't even know had been tight for years. The days that followed fell into a slow, quiet rhythm. They were two solitary people learning to orbit each other in a small, shared space. Their life was built not on words, but on work. They rose with the sun. Caleb would go out to hunt or check his trap lines, while Lenora set about turning the dusty cabin into a home. She scrubbed the floors, washed the windows until they gleamed, and aired out the musty blankets in the sun. When Caleb returned, they would work together. They patched the holes in the roof with fresh mud and straw, their hands often brushing as they worked. They tilled a small patch of earth behind the cabin for a vegetable garden, the shared labor of turning the stubborn soil a silent conversation. He showed her how to set snares for rabbits, his large, calloused hands guiding hers with surprising gentleness. She, in turn, showed him how to use the herbs Martha had given her to make a tea that soothed the ache in his bad leg. Their conversations were sparse, made up of practical questions and simple answers. "More wood?" he'd ask. "The stew is ready," she'd reply. Yet, in the spaces between the words, something grew. A fragile trust, a comfortable companionship. She learned to read his moods by the set of his shoulders, and he learned to recognize her quiet contentment in the soft humming sound she made while she worked. One afternoon, after she managed to bake a passable loaf of bread in their temperamental hearth, he even offered her a smile. It was a small, fleeting thing that barely touched his lips, but it transformed his hard face, and Lenora felt it in her chest like a warm ray of sun. About a month after her arrival, a storm rolled in from the mountains. It came suddenly, a great bruised wall of cloud that swallowed the sun and unleashed a torrent of wind and rain. The wind howled around the small cabin like a hungry wolf, and the rain beat against the roof in a relentless, drumming tattoo. The world outside was reduced to a churning chaos of gray and black. Inside, however, it was warm and safe. The fire in the hearth crackled and spat, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. They had eaten their supper in near silence, the roar of the storm filling the space where words might have been. Now, they sat on the floor before the fire, Lenora mending one of Caleb's shirts, and Caleb cleaning his rifle, the scent of gun oil sharp in the air. The storm seemed to strip away the last of their defenses, enclosing them in an intimacy that was both comforting and charged with a new, unspoken tension. Lenora found her eyes drawn to him more and more. She watched the firelight play over the hard planes of his face, softening the harsh lines. She watched the focused, deliberate movements of his hands as he worked, noting their strength, their competence. He finished with the rifle and set it aside. He didn't pick up another task. He just sat there, staring into the flames, his broad shoulders slumped slightly. The silence in the cabin was now a different entity. It was no longer empty. It was full, humming with everything they had not said for weeks. Slowly, as if in a trance, Lenora set down her sewing. Caleb turned his head, his pale eyes finding hers in the dim light. The look they shared was longer than any before, a deep, searching gaze that asked 100 questions and answered them all. He saw not a plague sister, but Lenora, and she saw not a broken soldier, but Caleb. He reached out, his hand moving with an agonizing slowness, and gently took the mended shirt from her lap, setting it aside. Then, his fingers, rough and calloused, lightly brushed against her own. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. She didn't pull away. His hand covered hers, his thumb tracing a slow circle over her knuckles. She could feel a fine tremor running through him, a sign of a vulnerability that belied his stoic exterior. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, hoarse whisper, barely audible above the storm. "If you don't want this, Lenora," he said, his eyes locked on hers, raw and pleading, "I won't do a thing. You just say the word." He was giving her a choice. He was giving her the power. In that moment, he was offering her more respect and more honor than any man ever had. The last of her fear dissolved, washed away by a sudden, overwhelming wave of tenderness for this broken, honorable man. She didn't speak. Instead, she lifted his trembling hand to her face and softly pressed her lips to his rough knuckles. It was an answer, an acceptance, an offering of her own. A shudder went through him. He moved closer, his other hand coming up to cup her jaw, his touch incredibly gentle. He tilted her face up to his, and for a long moment, he just looked at her, his expression one of awe and disbelief. Then, he lowered his head and kissed her. The kiss was not smooth or practiced. It was hesitant, searching, a collision of two lonely souls who had forgotten the language of touch. It was tentative at first, then deepened with a desperate, pent-up hunger. It was the taste of wood smoke and rain, of solitude and sorrow, and of a hope so fierce it was painful. That night, in the warm, fire-lit cabin, with the storm raging outside like a wild beast, they came together. It was a tangle of clumsy, eager hands and shy, whispered words. It was timid and it was passionate, awkward and yet profoundly graceful. For Caleb, it was a breaking of the dam of grief he had carried for years, a sudden, blinding light in his long darkness. For Lenora, it was a reclamation of a body that had been deemed unclean, a rediscovery of a self she thought had been lost forever. Their shared loneliness, the vast, empty chasm each had carried within them for so long, finally broke open, and in the space it left, something new and fragile and beautiful began to grow. In the months that followed, their shared life took on the quiet, sturdy shape of a well-tended tree. They settled into a routine that was as comforting and predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. The small cabin, once a monument to one man's solitude, now held the warmth of two. It became a world unto itself, a fortress against the memories of the lives they had lived before. They were a husband and a wife in every way that mattered, bound not by a preacher's words or a legal document, but by the shared language of healing. Yet a shadow lingered. While Caleb's world had expanded to include her, Lenora's remained confined to the borders of the ranch. Their small patch of land was her sanctuary. But it was also her cage. Freedom was a taste she had been granted, but she was terrified that to venture beyond the gates would be to have it snatched away. The town of redemption loomed in her mind not as a place of commerce, but as a den of judgment. The memory of the sneering faces, of the dirt on her cheek as she lay on the ground, was a wound that had not yet scarred over. She would watch Caleb ride off towards town for supplies and feel a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, a fear that he would not return, or that he would return with the town's poison clinging to him. Caleb saw her fear. He saw it in the way her eyes would drift towards the distant line of the town, in the way she would fall silent whenever he mentioned needing to fetch salt or flour. He was a man of few words, but he was not a man without perception. He understood that the walls of her prison were invisible, but no less real for it. One evening, he returned from town not with sacks of supplies, but with a second horse in tow. It was a beautiful mare, a gentle creature with a coat the color of honey and a soft, intelligent eye. Lenora came out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron, and stopped dead, staring at the animal. "She's for you," Caleb said, his voice quiet. He avoided her gaze, focusing on adjusting the mare's lead rope. "A man I know owed me a debt. Figured it was time he paid it." Lenora was speechless. She approached the mare slowly, her hand outstretched. The horse nudged her palm with its soft nose. A gift of this magnitude was beyond her comprehension. It wasn't just a horse. It was a promise. It was the key to a world larger than the perimeter of their fence line. The next day, and for many days after, he taught her to ride, in the wide, open grasslands that surrounded their ranch, under a vast and empty sky. They found a new kind of intimacy. Caleb, who was so often silent and contained, became a patient, gentle teacher. He showed her how to saddle the mare, how to hold the reins, how to move with the rhythm of the horse's gait. And in this space, away from the confines of the cabin and the looming threat of the town, they laughed. It started when Lenora, growing overconfident, tried to urge the mare into a canter and nearly tumbled off, letting out a small shriek. Caleb caught her, his strong arm circling her waist to steady her, and a low chuckle rumbled deep in his chest. The sound was so unexpected, so rich and real, that Lenora found herself laughing in response, a pure, unburdened sound of joy that she thought had died in her long ago. They stood there for a moment in the tall grass, his arms still around her, smiling at each other. The loneliness that had clung to both of them like a shroud was, for a moment, completely gone, burned away by the bright, clean sunlight. The horse, whom she named Promise, became her legs, her freedom. She spent hours exploring the rolling hills and hidden creeks of their land, the wind in her hair, the rhythmic drumming of hooves against the earth a song of liberation. With every ride, her confidence grew, and the shadow of the town began, ever so slightly, to recede. The day it happened began like any other. They were eating breakfast when Lenora realized they had used the last of their sugar. It was a small thing, a minor inconvenience. Caleb offered to ride into town later, but a new, bold thought took root in Lenora's mind. She was Mrs. Caleb, a rancher's wife. She had a right to go to town, to buy her own sugar. The idea was terrifying, but also exhilarating. It was a final test of her new life. "No," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I'll go. I'll take Promise." Caleb stopped eating and looked at her, his expression unreadable. He saw the mix of fear and determination in her eyes. He knew what this meant to her. He didn't argue. He just gave a slow nod. "Be careful," he said, the two words freighted with a world of meaning. The ride to redemption was a battle between her resolve and her rising panic. She wore a simple bonnet, hoping it would obscure her face. As the dusty main street came into view, her heart hammered against her ribs. She dismounted in front of the general store, her hands trembling as she tied Promise to the hitching post. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples. For a few blessed moments, no one paid her any mind. She was just another customer. She found the sack of sugar and carried it to the counter, her eyes cast down. Mr. Gable, the proprietor, was weighing out some nails for another customer. Lenora waited, her entire body tense, praying to be ignored. Then the door opened again, and a woman's sharp, nasal voice cut through the quiet. "Well, look what the cat dragged in." Lenora froze. She recognized the voice. It was Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was a permanent mask of sour disapproval. Mrs. Gable's eyes, small and hard as beads of glass, fixed on Lenora. A slow, malicious smile spread across her face. Her voice rose, shrill and triumphant, loud enough for everyone in the store and on the street outside to hear. "It's her! I'd know that face anywhere. It's that plague woman from the camp." The world stopped. The man buying nails turned to stare. "Mister." Gable's hands froze over his scale. A hush fell over the store, thick and suffocating. Then came the whispers, a rustle of venom that spread from person to person. Lenora felt a dozen pairs of eyes on her, not as a woman, but as a contagion. The air grew thick with their judgment. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She dropped the sack of sugar, which burst on the floorboards, spilling a cloud of white at her feet. Without a word, she turned and fled, stumbling out of the store and into the hostile sunlight of the street. She untied Promise with fumbling, useless fingers, scrambled into the saddle, and galloped away from the town, the sound of Mrs. Gable's triumphant laughter chasing her all the way home. The news spread through Redemption like a brush fire. The reclusive, half-wild veteran from the hills had not just taken a wife. He had taken one of the town's quiet prejudice, which had been content to let the camp fester in isolation, now had a target. It was a scandal, an outrage. By nightfall, The entire town was buzzing with the story. The next afternoon, the town sheriff, a grim man named Eli, rode out to the ranch. He didn't dismount. He simply handed Caleb an official-looking letter. "Mayor Thompson wants to see you. Town Hall, tomorrow at noon. Don't be late." The town hall was a small, stifling room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and sweat. The mayor sat behind a large desk, flanked by Mr. Gable and a few other prominent townsmen. They were the arbiters of redemption's morality, and their faces were hard and unforgiving. "Caleb," Mayor Thompson began, foregoing any pleasantries, "we have a problem, a serious one. You've brought a blight into our community." Caleb stood before them, his hands at his sides, his face a granite mask. "I've brought my wife home." "You've brought one of those women from the scourge." Mr. Gable spat, his jowls trembling with indignation. "A woman of unknown health and questionable character. It's a danger to us all." "The point, Caleb," the mayor cut in smoothly, "is one of public order. Your presence in town is now a disruption. More importantly, your access to the community well and the water rights that come with your land deed are privileges granted by this township. Privileges that can be revoked." The threat hung in the air, cold and deadly. To be cut off from the town's water supply was to be sentenced to a slow, dusty death. "We are giving you a choice," the mayor continued. "Send the woman back where she came from. Renounce this union. Do that, and this all goes away. You can go back to your solitude, and we can go back to our peace. Refuse, and you will find that this is a very hard country to survive in alone." Caleb looked at each of them, his pale blue eyes flat and cold as ice. He thought of Lenora's laughter in the sun. He thought of the quiet warmth in his cabin, of the feeling of her sleeping beside him. He thought of the way her presence had filled the vast, aching emptiness inside him. For the first time in years, he was not just surviving, he was living. He gave them his answer. "No." The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a gunshot. Before they could protest, he turned and walked out, leaving the stunned and furious councilman in his wake. When he returned to the cabin, Lenora was sitting at the table, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She had packed a small bundle with the few things she owned. "I heard the sheriff," she said, her voice choked with guilt. "It's my fault. I never should have gone. I've brought this trouble to you, Caleb. I'll leave. I'll go back. They won't bother you anymore if I'm gone." Caleb stared at her, at the bundle on the table, at the utter despair on her face. He saw her trying to crawl back into the prison of her past, to take the blame for the world's cruelty onto her own shoulders. All the silence, all the carefully controlled stillness he had cultivated for years, suddenly shattered. A raw, powerful emotion he couldn't name, rage, love, terror, rose up in him like a flood. For the first time since she had known him, Caleb raised his voice. It wasn't just a shout, it was a roar, a sound torn from the deepest part of his soul, a sound of a man refusing to lose the only thing he had left. "No!" The word exploded in the small cabin, making the very timbers seem to vibrate. Lenora flinched back, her eyes wide with shock. He strode to her, his movements fierce and full of a desperate energy. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip tight but not painful. "You will not leave," he said, his voice ragged, his eyes blazing with a fire she had never seen. "This is your home. You are my wife." He shook his head, a look of raw anguish on his face. "Don't you understand? You are the only thing that makes me feel alive." Tears streamed down Lenora's face as she stared at him, at this man who had been a ghost, now roaring with life to keep her by his side. She fell against his chest, her sobs shaking her entire body, and his arms came around her, holding her as if he were drowning and she was the only solid thing in the world. They stood like that for a long time, the two of them against the world, but the world was not content to leave them be. That night, as they lay in bed, The comforting darkness of the cabin was shattered by a sudden, violent crash. A rock flew through the window, sending shards of glass skittering across the floor. It was followed by another, striking the log wall with a heavy thud. Outside, they could hear the jeering laughter of men and the sound of hoofbeats fading into the night. Caleb rose and went to the broken window. Staring out into the darkness, their fortress had been breached. Their sanctuary was no longer safe. The town of Redemption had declared its war. The nights of thrown rocks became a grim routine. Each crash of glass or thud against the log walls was a fresh punctuation mark in the town's long, hateful sentence. Caleb would replace the window panes with oiled parchment, a temporary fix that only served to dim the light inside the cabin, casting their lives in a perpetual twilight. They were under siege, not by an army with flags and bugles, but by the slow, grinding pressure of their neighbors' hatred. This simmering war took its toll. Lenora, who had just begun to taste freedom, retreated into herself once more. The laughter that Caleb had coaxed out of her in the sunny grasslands died in her throat. She moved about the cabin with a quiet, haunted efficiency, her eyes constantly flitting towards the broken window, her ears straining for the sound of hoofbeats in the night. Caleb watched her, his heart a cold, heavy lump in his chest. The rage he had felt in the mayor's office had cooled into a hard, bitter resolve. He had promised her a safe harbor, and instead, he had brought her into the heart of a new storm. News from the outside world came to them in whispers and fragments, carried by the same traveling merchants who had once been Lenora's only link to a world beyond the camp. It was one of these men, a kind-faced peddler named Silas, who brought the story to their door. He was replenishing their stock of salt and coffee when he told them, "There's a bad fever in town," he said, his voice low as he glanced nervously over his shoulder. "The Miller boy, Jacob, not yet 10 years old, been seized by it for 3 days. The doctors bled him twice, but it's no use. The boy's burning up. His mother, Abigail, is beside herself. Won't let anyone near, afraid the sickness will spread." After Silas left, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Lenora stood by the table, her hands clenched together. The Miller boy, she knew Abigail Miller. She was a stern, church-going woman who had always looked at the women from the camp with a particular kind of pious disgust. And yet, she was also a mother, watching her child die. "They say the fever makes the skin hot as a skillet," Lenora said, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking to herself. "And the throat closes up so they can't drink." Caleb looked at her. He saw a familiar light in her eyes, the focused, knowledgeable look she got when she was tending to their garden or brewing her herbal teas. He knew what she was thinking. In the camp, sickness was a constant companion. The women there had been forced to become their own healers, their knowledge passed down from one to the next, a grim inheritance of survival. They knew the fevers. They knew which roots to boil to bring down the heat, which leaves to crush to soothe a raw throat. "It's not our business, Lenora," Caleb said, his voice rougher than he intended. It was a lie. He knew it, and she knew it. The boy's suffering was now a part of their world, whether they wanted it to be or not. "He is a child," she replied simply. That night, she couldn't rest. She paced the small cabin like a caged animal while Caleb watched, his heart torn. To let her go into that town was to risk everything. They could beat her, arrest her, drive her out for good. But to keep her here, to force her to listen to the echo of a child suffering when she held the means to help, that felt like a different kind of damnation. Just after midnight, she stopped pacing and looked at him, her eyes full of a terrible resolve. "I have to go." He didn't argue. He just rose, pulled on his boots, and saddled Promise in the darkness. He helped her wrap a dark shawl around her head and shoulders, obscuring her face in a small leather pouch. She placed dried willow bark, yarrow flowers, and a tincture of mint. As she mounted the mare, he laid a hand on her arm. "If you are not back by sunrise," he said, his voice low and intense. "I am coming for you." Lenora rode into redemption like a ghost. The town was dark and silent, a sleeping beast. She tethered Promise in a hidden alley and crept through the back ways to the Miller house. A single lamp burned in a downstairs window. She peered through, her heart pounding. She could see Abigail Miller slumped in a chair beside a small bed, her face a mask of exhaustion and despair. The woman was weeping, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Taking a deep breath, Lenora slipped around to the back of the house and gently tried the kitchen door. It was unlatched. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The sound made Abigail jump to her feet, a small cry of alarm on her lips. She spun around, her eyes wide with fear, and saw the hooded figure in her kitchen. "Who's there? Get out!" she hissed, grabbing a fireplace poker. Lenora slowly pulled back her shawl. Abigail's face went from fear to disbelief, and then to pure, unadulterated hatred. "You!" she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "The plague woman! Get out of my house before I scream!" "Your son," Lenora said, her voice calm and steady despite the wild beating of her own heart. "The fever. I can help." "Help?" Abigail laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "You want to put your curse on him? I'd rather see him in God's hands than yours. Get out." "God's hands are letting him die," Lenora said, her words sharp and clear. "He is burning from the inside out, and he is thirsty. Let me help him drink. Let me cool his skin. If his fever is not lower by the time the sun rises, I will leave, and you can tell everyone you drove the witch away." Desperation warred with prejudice on Abigail's face. She looked from the hateful figure before her to the small, still form of her son on the bed. He let out a weak, pitiful moan, his body twitching. That sound broke her. Her shoulders sagged. The poker fell from her hand with a clatter, and she sank back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. It was not acceptance, but surrender. For the next 4 hours, Lenora worked. She moved with a quiet, practiced confidence, ignoring Abigail's hostile glare. She boiled the willow bark into a bitter tea, forcing a few drops at a time between the boy's cracked lips. She crushed the yarrow and mint into a cool poultice and laid it on his forehead and chest. She bathed his small, hot body with cool water, whispering soothing words to him, not as an outcast, but as a mother. Slowly, miraculously, the tide began to turn. The violent shivering subsided. The boy's breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, grew deeper and more even. Just as the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the sky, his fever broke. A sheen of sweat covered his skin, and for the first time in days, he fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Lenora stood and looked at the sleeping child. Her work was done. She turned to leave, her body aching with exhaustion. "Wait!" a voice choked out behind her. She turned. Abigail Miller was on her knees, tears streaming down her face, her hands clasped before her as if in prayer. The hatred was gone, replaced by a raw, overwhelming wave of gratitude and shame. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Oh, God, thank you." Lenora simply nodded and slipped out the back door, melting back into the shadows as the town began to wake. Caleb was waiting for her at the edge of their land, his rifle across his saddle. The relief that washed over his face when he saw her was so profound it was almost painful. They rode back to the cabin in silence. The next day, Silas, the peddler, returned, his face alight with the news. "It's a miracle," he declared. "The Miller boy is well. Abigail says she prayed all night, and the Lord sent an angel to break the fever. The whole town is celebrating God's mercy." Caleb and Lenora looked at each other over the table. An angel. They had taken her gift, her knowledge, her courage, and they had erased her from the story, giving the credit to a faceless angel to preserve their own prejudice. The injustice of it was a bitter pill to swallow. That night, Caleb couldn't sit still. The cabin that had been his sanctuary now felt like a cage. He paced back and forth, the conflict raging within him. He had built his life on a simple principle: stay out of the world's way, and it will stay out of yours. But the world had not stayed out. It had thrown rocks through his window, and it had stolen his wife's dignity. Hiding was no longer an option. His quiet life of solitude had been a retreat from pain. But now, that same retreat felt like cowardice. He had to do more than just protect Lenora. He had to fight for her. He stopped pacing and turned to her. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice grim. Lenora's face fell. "You want to leave? To run?" "No," he said, and his eyes held a new, hard light. "Not run. We're going to go back." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "Back where?" "To the camp," he said. "We're not going to hide from them anymore. We're not going to let them define who you are, or who those women are. If they think that place is a blight, then we will make it a garden. We will build it up right under their noses. We will live there. With them. Not as outcasts. As a community." It was a radical, insane idea, to willingly return to the place she had so desperately fled. But as she looked at Caleb's face, at the fierce conviction there, she saw the truth of it. Hiding had not brought them peace. It was time to stand and fight, not with guns, but with shovels and hammers, with dignity and purpose. Their return to the Plague Sisters' camp was met with stunned silence. The women gathered, their faces a mixture of suspicion, confusion, and a flicker of hope as Caleb and Lenora rode in, their pack horse laden with tools and supplies. The work began immediately. Caleb, with his rancher's practical skills, was a force of nature. He showed the women how to reinforce their flimsy tents, how to build sturdy, one-room shelters from scavenged wood and packed earth. He organized the digging of a new, deeper well, ensuring a clean water supply. He mapped out a proper sanitation system, replacing the foul-smelling pits with deep, covered latrines. Slowly, painstakingly, the scar on the land began to heal. The camp, once a chaotic jumble of misery, started to take on the shape of a small, orderly village. Lenora, meanwhile, became the heart of their new community. She taught the younger women the healing arts she knew, showing them which plants to gather and how to prepare them. She and Caleb pooled their resources, buying bolts of cloth and skeins of yarn from Silas. They started a quilting circle, their needles flying as they turned scraps into beautiful, warm blankets. Caleb, remembering a skill from his youth, built a small, crude kiln by the creek bed. He taught the women to shape the river clay into sturdy pots and bowls. For the first time, they were not just surviving, they were creating. They had goods to sell, a purpose to their days. A quiet pride began to replace the shame that had been their constant companion. But their progress did not go unnoticed. In redemption, the stories of the changing camp were met with growing resentment. The town had defined itself by what it was not. It was not the camp. But now, that line was blurring. The object of their scorn was becoming a source of industry, of pride. It was an affront to their established order. One night, the town's resentment boiled over. A group of men, their courage stoked by whiskey from the saloon, rode out from redemption. They carried torches, their bright flames licking at the darkness. The attack was swift and brutal. They descended on the sleeping camp like specters of hate, tossing their torches onto the roofs of the newly built shelters. The dry wood and canvas erupted in flame. Panic and screams filled the night air as the women scrambled from their beds, their brief dream of peace turning into a fiery nightmare. Lenora and Caleb were helping Martha guide a group of women to the safety of the creek bed when a terrified scream cut through the chaos. It was Sarah. "Lily!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at one of the burning shelters. "Lily's still inside." Lily was a small, silent orphan of 6, whom Sarah had taken under her wing. In the panic, The child had hidden under her cot and been trapped. Caleb didn't hesitate. The man who had once stood by and watched as Lenora was pushed to the ground was gone forever. He looked at Lenora, a world of love and resolve passing between them in a single glance. And then he ran towards the fire. He plunged into the burning structure without a thought for his own safety. The heat was a physical blow, the smoke a choking, blinding fog. He could hear the child's terrified whimpers. He dropped to the floor, crawling under the suffocating smoke, and found her huddled under the cot. He scooped her up in his arms, shielding her small body with his own, and turned to fight his way back out. A burning roof timber crashed down, showering him in a rain of sparks and fire. He roared in pain but did not stop. He burst out of the collapsing shelter just as the roof caved in, a human torch carrying a precious burden. He stumbled forward, placing Lily into Sarah's waiting arms, before his legs gave out and he collapsed onto the scorched earth, his back and arms a landscape of raw, angry burns. The roar of the fire was replaced by the sound of Lenora's ragged sobs in the hellish, flickering light of the smoldering ruins. Surrounded by the wails and frightened whispers of the other women, she worked to save her husband's life. They had carried him to the creek bed, away from the heat, and laid him on a bed of blankets. His breathing was shallow, his face pale and smeared with soot. His eyes closed against the agony. Her hands, which had been so steady when she'd tended to the Miller boy, now trembled uncontrollably. This was not a stranger's child. This was the center of her world, the man who had breathed life back into her soul, and he was horribly burned. With Martha at her side, her old cynicism burned away by the night's terror. They set to work. They washed away the soot and grime with cool creek water, revealing the angry, blistered skin across his back and arms. Lenora fought back waves of nausea, her medical knowledge a cold, hard stone of fact in a churning sea of emotion. She sent the other women scrambling for the herbs she knew she needed: yarrow to ward off infection, crushed plantain leaves to draw out the heat, and the inner bark of a slippery elm to make a soothing poultice. As she gently cleaned his wounds, her tears fell freely, splashing onto his skin. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, clouded with pain. He tried to speak, but it came out as a hoarse cough. "Hush now. Caleb," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Save your strength." She worked for hours, her movements becoming more certain as her resolve hardened. She would not let him die. She had not found him only to lose him to the flames of other men's hatred. When she had finally dressed his wounds, covering them with clean strips of linen, she collapsed beside him. Taking his uninjured hand in both of hers, she laid her cheek against it, feeling the weak but steady beat of his pulse. "Why?" she whispered to him, the question a raw ache in her throat. "Why would you risk your life like that? For a child, for this place, for me?" His eyes opened again, clearer this time. He looked at her, his gaze full of a love so profound it stole her breath. He squeezed her hand weakly, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "For you," he breathed, "and for people like you." He had not said *women *like you. He had said *people *. In that moment, Lenora understood that his sacrifice was not just for her, or for the child, or for the camp. It was for every soul that had ever been cast out, judged and condemned without cause. It was his final, definitive answer to the ghosts of his past and the cruelty of the present. The fire that gutted the camp sent a shockwave through the town of Redemption. The acrid smell of smoke hung in the air for days, a constant, nagging reminder of the violence that had been done. And with that reminder came a schism. The town's single, unified voice of condemnation fractured. In the saloon, the men who had ridden with the torches, led by the same lanky, mean-faced man who had pushed Lenora, boasted of their work, claiming they had simply cleaned out a hornet's nest. But their bravado was met with an uneasy silence from others. The news that a child had nearly perished in the flames had soured the victory for many. To harass a group of helpless women was one thing. To nearly burn a child alive was another. It was an act that felt less like righteous justice and more like cowardly murder. The women of the town were even more divided. Mrs. Gable declared it was God's will, a cleansing fire. But other mothers, clutching their own children a little tighter, were horrified. The story of the angel who had saved the Miller boy resurfaced, now colored with a dark and terrible irony. They had celebrated a miracle, all while their husbands and sons were plotting an atrocity against the very people who might have harbored that angel. The town's moral certainty began to crumble. 2 days after the fire, a man appeared at the edge of the ruined camp. He was Thomas, the father of the little girl, Lily. He was a wiry farmer who had always been among the loudest voices condemning the camp, his fear and ignorance fueling a deep-seated resentment. He stood there for a long time, twisting his hat in his hands, his face a picture of shame. The women of the camp watched him, their expressions hard and wary. Martha stepped forward, a shovel held loosely in her hand like a weapon. "What do you want?" she demanded. Thomas flinched but held his ground. He looked past her, his eyes searching for the makeshift tent where they had laid the injured Caleb. I came to see the man," he stammered. "The one who saved my Lily." Lenora emerged from the tent. She looked at Thomas, her face pale with exhaustion but her gaze clear and steady. She led him inside. Caleb was lying on a cot, awake but weak, his back and arms a landscape of white bandages. Thomas stopped at the foot of the cot, his throat working. He saw the price this stranger had paid for his daughter's life. The man's hat fell from his nerveless fingers. He dropped to his knees, his head bowed, and a dry, racking sob shook his body. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words torn from him. "I was one of them that called you names. I let my fear make me hateful. And you saved my little girl." He looked up, his eyes swimming with tears. "I don't have much, but I have timber, a whole stand of it on my north pasture. It's yours, to rebuild. Everything I have, it's yours." His visit was the first crack in the dam. His genuine public remorse gave others the courage to question their own actions. The tide, ever so slowly, was beginning to turn. A week later, another visitor arrived. This time it was an old man on a tired-looking mule. He was Reverend Michael, a traveling minister who passed through the territory every few years. He was a man of the cloth, but his church was the open prairie, and his congregation was made up of the lonely, the lost, and the forgotten. He had heard the stories in town of the fire, of the hero, of the plague woman who healed children. He sat with Lenora and a still-recovering Caleb, sipping a cup of chicory coffee. "The Lord's work is not always done in a church," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes it is done with herbs and courage. Sometimes it is done by walking into a fire." He looked from Caleb to Lenora, his wise old eyes full of a deep compassion. "I also heard that you two are not formally wed in the eyes of God or the law." He held up a hand before they could speak. "I know a bond of the heart is the truest bond, but the law is a shield. A marriage certificate is a piece of paper, but it is a paper that makes them recognize you. Mrs. He paused, looking at Caleb. "Her name is Lenora," Caleb said, his voice still weak but clear. "It gives them no choice but to recognize Mrs. Lenora," the Reverend finished. "It gives her a place. It silences their whispers. I would be honored to perform the ceremony, here, in this place, for all to see." And so, the wedding was planned. It was not a grand affair. The cathedral was the open sky. The pews were rough-hewn benches made from Thomas's timber. The altar was a simple wooden table set beneath the sprawling branches of a great oak tree, whose leaves had been scorched and blackened by the fire. The guests were the women of the camp, their faces scrubbed clean, their patched dresses mended and pressed. Sarah had picked bouquets of wild prairie flowers, black-eyed Susans, and Indian paintbrush, and placed them in the clay pots they had made. Lenora wore her only dress, but she had washed it until it was soft and clean, and Sarah had woven a small crown of wildflowers for her hair. She was more beautiful than any bride in satin and lace. Caleb stood waiting for her under the charred tree. He was pale and moved stiffly, leaning on a cane, his arms still heavily bandaged. But as Lenora walked towards him, escorted by a proud and weeping Martha, his eyes shone with a love that was stronger than any fire. Reverend Michael's words were simple and true, his voice carrying on the gentle breeze. He spoke of love born from hardship, of light found in the deepest darkness, of two broken souls who had come together to make a new and unbreakable whole. When Caleb, in his rough, quiet voice, and Lenora, in her clear, soft one, spoke their vows, there was not a dry eye among the women. They were not just witnessing a marriage, they were witnessing their own redemption. That night, their wedding night, was nothing like their first night together. They were not two strangers seeking refuge from a storm. They were a husband and a wife. Their union sanctified by their own community and consecrated by their shared sacrifice. The women had worked all day to finish one of the new, sturdy cabins, making it a bridal suite. The wood was fresh and smelled of pine. The bed was soft with a new quilt, a riot of color stitched together by 24 loving hands. A single candle burned on the nightstand, its flame dancing softly. Caleb was exhausted from the day's events, but his eyes were full of a deep, peaceful contentment. Lenora helped him remove his shirt, her touch infinitely tender as she navigated his bandages. She sat beside him on the bed, the candlelight softening the lines of weariness on her face. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear. There was only a profound sense of rightness, of coming home. He reached up with his good hand and gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Lenora," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of release, of a final, shuddering letting go of the past. She looked at him, her eyes shining in the candlelight, and she gave voice to the truth that had been forged in the fire. "I'm not sick, Caleb," she whispered, her voice full of a quiet, powerful certainty. "I was never sick. I was just rejected by the world." He drew her closer, his gaze holding hers. "Then the world is blind," he said softly, and he leaned in to kiss her, a kiss that held no desperation, only a deep and endless love. It was a kiss of equals, of survivors, of a husband and wife who had walked through the flames and had not just found each other, but had found themselves. Change did not come to redemption like a sudden flood, but like a slow, painstaking thaw after a long and bitter winter. It began not with apologies or grand gestures, but with the quiet, undeniable logic of commerce. The quilts the women of the camp stitched were not only beautiful, they were warm. The pottery they fired was not only handsome, it was sturdy and held water without leaking. Silas, the peddler, was the first to act as a formal merchant, loading his wagon with their wares and singing their praises in the next town over. Then Thomas, the farmer whose daughter Caleb had saved, brought his wife to the camp's edge. She was a timid woman who had always crossed the street to avoid the Plague Sisters, but she left with a blue and white quilt and 2 fine clay bowls, her face a mixture of awe and embarrassment. Slowly, reluctantly, others followed. A rancher's wife would send her son to buy a pot of Martha's salve for a horse's sores. A miner would quietly purchase a blanket, telling no one where he got it. They came for the quality of the goods, but they left with something more, a seed of doubt planted in the hard soil of their prejudice. They saw women working, creating, and living with a dignity that defied the ugly names they had been called. They saw the neat, rebuilt cabins, the clean well, and the laughing children who were now properly cared for. The camp was no longer a festering wound on the edge of town. It was a community. The most significant shift came through Martha. The cynical, sharp-tongued woman had a healer's hands and a knowledge of herbs that bordered on miraculous. When a wave of lung sickness swept through Redemption that winter, the town doctor's remedies of bleeding and blistering proved useless. People began to fall ill and die. It was Abigail Miller who, in desperation, secretly sent for Martha to look at her elderly mother. Martha came, her face a mask of indifference, and brewed a pungent, steaming tea of mullein leaf and horehound. Within 2 days, the old woman was sitting up in bed, breathing freely. The story could not be contained. Soon, a quiet but steady trickle of townspeople began making their way to the camp, not with stones, but with pleas for help. Martha never smiled, never offered words of comfort. She would simply examine the sick, dispense her remedies with gruff instructions, and accept whatever payment was offered. A chicken, a sack of potatoes, a few coins. She became their reluctant physician, and with every life she saved, she chipped away at the wall of hatred that had imprisoned them for so long. The word plague was spoken less and less on the streets of Redemption. It was hard to curse the woman who had just saved your child's life. One cool evening in the spring, nearly a year after the fire, a young man rode into the camp. He was nervous, dismounting from his horse with jerky movements and holding his hat in both hands as if it were a shield. It was Ben, the same young man who had thrown the first stones at Lenora and her friends on that fateful day at the well. He asked for Caleb. The women of the camp stopped their work, their eyes following the boy with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Caleb, who was mending a harness outside his cabin, rose slowly to his feet. He was no longer the stooped, haunted man who had first come to this country. He stood tall, his shoulders broad and his gaze steady. The burns on his arms had healed into puckered scars, a permanent reminder of his sacrifice. He was the undisputed patriarch of this small, resilient village, and his authority was absolute. "I've come to ask," Ben stammered, his eyes fixed on the toes of his boots. "I've come to ask for Sarah's hand." A collective gasp went through the women. Sarah, who had been washing vegetables by the well, dropped a carrot in the dirt, her face flushing a deep crimson. Caleb did not speak for a long time. He simply looked at the young man, his pale blue eyes searching, weighing, judging. He remembered this boy's sneering face, his cruel laughter. "Why?" Caleb's voice was low, but it carried the weight of a judge's gavel. "Because I love her," Ben said, finally finding the courage to meet Caleb's gaze. "I see her when she comes to the creek for water. I've seen her for months. She's good and kind, and she shines." He took a shaky breath. "And I am ashamed. For what I did, for how I was. I was a fool, listening to the talk of other fools. Sarah, she's made me want to be a better man. I swear to you, sir, I will work my fingers to the bone for her. I'll give her a good home. I'll protect her." Caleb's expression did not soften. His eyes were hard as flint. He was the guardian of these women, the keeper of their fragile peace. He would not give one of them over to a man who did not understand the true meaning of honor. "Protect her from what?" Caleb asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "From men like you used to be?" The question struck Ben like a physical blow. The color drained from his face. He nodded, his shame complete and absolute. "Yes, sir," he whispered. "From men exactly like I used to be." That was the answer Caleb had been waiting for. He saw the genuine remorse in the boy's eyes, the hard-won humility. He gave a single, curt nod. "The choice is Sarah's," he said, then turned and walked back to his harness. The audience concluded. Ben, his heart pounding with relief and terror, turned to look at Sarah, who was now smiling through a veil of happy tears. That night, lying in bed beside Caleb, Lenora felt a joy so profound it was almost painful. "He was one of the ones who threw stones at me," she said softly. "I know," Caleb replied, his arm tightening around her. And now he wants to marry our Sarah. She laughed, a quiet, wonderful sound. The world is changing. We changed it, he said. It was a few weeks later that Lenora realized her own world was about to change in a way she had never dared to imagine. Her monthly courses, always a grimly reliable marker of time in the camp, were late. At first, she dismissed it. Their lives were hard. Such things happened. But then a week passed, and another. A strange tenderness began in her breasts, and a new, unfamiliar weariness settled deep in her bones, with a heart beating a frantic rhythm of terror and hope. She went to Martha. The old woman examined her with knowing eyes, asking a few blunt questions before placing a gnarled hand on Lenora's lower abdomen. A long silence passed. Then a rare, craggy smile broke across Martha's face. "Well, now," she said, her voice softer than Lenora had ever heard it. "It seems our quiet little village is about to get a bit louder." Lenora was pregnant. When she told Caleb that evening, he did not react as she expected. He didn't shout with joy or lift her in his arms. He went utterly still, the color draining from his face. He sat down heavily on the edge of their bed, his head in his hands. A terrible fear gripped Lenora. Did he not want the child? "Caleb," she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked up at her, and she was shocked to see raw, naked fear in his eyes. "I've seen too much death, Lenora," he said, his voice ragged. "The war, but childbirth. It's a different kind of battlefield. This land is hard. Sickness comes easy. I can't lose you. I would not survive it." She went to him then, kneeling before him and taking his hands in hers. She saw his joy, but it was buried deep beneath a soldier's dread of loss. "You will not lose me," she said, her voice full of a strength she didn't know she possessed. "And we are not alone. We have Martha. We have our sisters. This child will not be born into hardship and fear. It will be born into a fortress of love. Our love." His fear slowly gave way to a quiet, reverent awe. He placed a trembling hand on her still flat belly, his touch as gentle as a prayer. A slow smile, real and full of wonder, finally spread across his face. He was going to be a father. The months that followed were the happiest of their lives. The entire community fussed over Lenora. Martha brewed special teas to ward off morning sickness. Sarah stitched a tiny layette from the softest flannel she could find. Caleb was fiercely protective, forbidding her from lifting anything heavy and watching her every move with a hawk's eye. His fear was still there, a shadow in the corner, but it was overshadowed by a deep and abiding joy. The crisis came without warning. 2 months before the child was due, it was the middle of the night. Lenora was woken by a sharp, stabbing pain in her abdomen, a cramp so violent it stole her breath. She cried out, and Caleb was awake in an instant. A moment later, she felt a gush of warmth, and when Caleb lit the lamp, they both saw the terrifying, unmistakable stain of blood on the sheets. Panic, cold and sharp, ripped through the camp. Caleb's worst fears were being realized. Lenora was losing the baby. Martha was there in minutes, her face grim, her movements efficient. She sent Sarah running for boiling water and clean linens, barking orders that cut through the rising hysteria. The women of the camp gathered outside the small cabin, their faces pale in the moonlight. They were not a crowd of curious onlookers. They were a vigil. They began to hum, a low, mournful, prayerful sound that rose and fell in the darkness. Inside the cabin, it was a scene of controlled chaos. Lenora was writhing in pain, her face slick with sweat, her moans punctuated by Caleb's desperate, whispered reassurances. He knelt by the bed, holding her hand, his face a mask of helpless agony. He had faced down cannon fire and ridden into a burning building, but he had never felt so utterly powerless. "It's too soon," Martha muttered, her hands moving over Lenora's belly. "The child is turned wrong, and she's losing too much blood. The air in the room grew thick with the metallic scent of blood and fear. The hours dragged on. Lenora's cries grew weaker, her strength failing. The women's humming outside grew louder, more urgent, a chorus of shared prayer against the encroaching darkness. Caleb's knuckles were white as he gripped his wife's hand. His head bowed, his own silent prayers a desperate, frantic litany. This was it. This was the price of happiness. The cruel, indifferent world was about to take everything from him again. Just as the first gray light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. When all hope seemed lost, Martha took a desperate gamble. With firm, practiced hands, she began to press and knead Lenora's abdomen, her face a mask of intense concentration. Trying to manually turn the baby, Lenora screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure agony. And then, suddenly, silence. The pain stopped. Lenora lay limp on the bed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The humming outside faltered, in the terrible, ringing silence. Caleb thought he had lost them both. But then, Martha let out a sharp, triumphant cry. And in the next instant, a new sound filled the room, thin and reedy at first, then growing into a lusty, furious wail. It was the cry of a newborn child. Martha, her face shining with sweat and tears, lifted a small, blood-streaked form into the lamplight. "You have a son," she announced, her voice thick with emotion. Caleb stared, his mind unable to process the miracle. The sound of his son's cry was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. It was the sound of life. It was the sound of victory. He looked at Lenora. She was pale, exhausted, but her eyes were open, and she was smiling, a weak but radiant smile of pure, unadulterated love. The cabin door opened, and the women outside peered in, their faces anxious. They saw the baby, they heard his cries, and a great collective sigh of relief and joy went through them. Tears streamed down their faces as they embraced one another. Martha cleaned the baby and wrapped him in the flannel blanket Sarah had made. She placed him in Lenora's waiting arms, and there, in the first light of a new day, surrounded by the community that had once been called a plague, their son, a child of impossible hope, was welcomed into the world. The years, which had once been a relentless succession of hardships to be endured, now fell away from them like soft, gentle seasons. 15 winters had passed since the fire. 15 summers had baked the rich earth of their gardens. The collection of ragged tents and desperate shelters was a distant memory, a ghost story told only in whispers by the oldest of the women. In its place stood a village. They had built it with their own hands, with timber from Thomas's farm, and stones pulled from the creek bed. The cabins were sturdy and well chinked, with real glass in the windows and stone chimneys that sent plumes of fragrant wood smoke into the vast blue sky. Neat rows of vegetables grew in what was once barren, cracked earth. There were chicken coops, a small, shared barn, and a potter's shed with a large, efficient kiln. It was a place of quiet industry, of calm and settled peace. And at the entrance to the village, where the dusty track from Redemption met their land, stood a large, hand-carved wooden sign. The letters were carved deep and painted white, and they did not read the Scourge or the Pox Patch. They read, "The Reclaimed Village." Caleb and Lenora had aged in the kind way that happiness allows. The silver in Caleb's dark hair was now more prevalent than the black, and the lines around his eyes were etched not from weariness, but from years of squinting into the sun and smiling at his son. His limp was a permanent part of him, a dull ache on cold mornings, but he no longer moved with the stoop of a man bracing for a blow. He stood tall, the quiet, respected elder of their community. Lenora's face was softer, the sharp edges of old sorrows smoothed away. Her hands, though calloused from gardening and kneading dough, were rarely still, always busy mending a shirt, stirring a pot, or tending to a sick neighbor. Their cabin was the largest in the village. with 2 rooms and a wide, covered porch where they sat in the evenings. It was a home filled with the scent of baking bread and drying herbs, and the sound of laughter. That sound often came from their son, Nathan. At 14, he was a perfect fusion of his parents. He had Caleb's height and quiet strength, and Lenora's gentle eyes and compassionate heart. He was a child of the new world they had built, and the old one was entirely foreign to him. He knew, in the vague way a child knows history, that there had been a fire long ago, and that his father had been a hero. But the word plague, in the context of his mother and her friends, was a term he had never heard. To him, the women of the village were just people. They were Aunt Martha, who was grumpy but made the best cough syrup, and Aunt Sarah, who always had a story and a piece of gingerbread for him. He rode his pony with a fearless freedom that was a constant, breathtaking miracle to Lenora. He had friends in redemption, the sons and daughters of the very people who had once thrown stones. He would ride into town to fetch the mail or trade eggs for salt, and he was greeted not with jeers, but with friendly waves. The past was a foreign country, and Nathan was a native of the present. The town's acceptance had become a simple, unremarkable fact of life. The bridge between the 2 communities had been built not of grand apologies, but of 1,000 small, sturdy planks of shared experience. It was built of Martha's remedies, of the village's warm quilts, of Ben and Sarah's happy marriage and their 3 boisterous children. It was built on the shared grief of a harsh winter and the shared joy of a bountiful harvest. The final, official seal on this new piece had come the year before. Mayor Thompson, now an old man with a stoop of his own, had formally requested that Lenora, the woman his council had once tried to banish, lead a class for the young women of redemption. He asked her to teach them the fundamentals of herbal medicine and practical nursing. The first day she walked into the town's small schoolhouse. Her heart had hammered against her ribs with the memory of her flight from the general store so many years ago. But the faces that looked up at her were not full of scorn. They were young, curious, and eager to learn. Abigail Miller's daughter was in the front row, and as Lenora began to speak, her voice gaining confidence with every word, she felt the last of the old ghosts turn to dust and blow away. The plague woman had become the town's most respected healer and teacher. And so it was, on a warm evening in late summer, that Caleb and Lenora sat on their porch, watching the sun set. It was a spectacle they had witnessed thousands of times, but one that never lost its majesty. The sky was awash in fiery strokes of orange, pink, and deep violet, and the light washed over the desert landscape, turning the distant mesas a deep, bruised red. The air was cool and smelled of dust and the sweet scent of night-blooming flowers from Lenora's garden. Nathan was out on the prairie, camping with Ben's eldest son. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that exists only between 2 people who know each other's thoughts without needing to speak them. They were no longer the 2 broken, solitary people who had met in a ruined stable. They were the architects of a world. Lenora leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder, a familiar, comforting gesture. His arm came around her, his hand, now gnarled with age and arthritis, covering hers. "All those years ago," she said softly, her voice a near whisper, her eyes on the fading light. "In the camp, before you came, I truly believed I was worth nothing. Less than nothing, just a piece of spoiled goods the world had thrown away." Caleb was silent for a long moment, watching the last sliver of the sun dip below the horizon. He turned his head, his pale eyes, still so clear and full of love, finding hers in the gathering twilight. A slow, gentle smile touched his lips, crinkling the weathered skin at the corners of his eyes. "I was the one living like I was worth nothing," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Hiding from the world in that ruin of a cabin, hiding from myself." He squeezed her hand, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that had not dimmed with the passing of the years. "You, Lenora, you were never worth nothing. You were worth everything." It just took a fool like me, and the rest of this blind world, a long time to finally see it. She lifted his hand to her lips and kissed the scarred, wrinkled knuckles, a gesture that echoed their first true connection in the storm. They held hands, two old lovers intertwined, as the last of the day's light washed over them. It illuminated the silver in their hair, the deep, settled lines on their faces, not lines of sorrow, but a beautiful, intricate map of a shared life. They were the wrinkles of laughter and tears, of hard work and quiet joy, the testament to a love that had been born in the deepest darkness, had walked through fire, and had, against all odds, reclaimed the world. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to hear from you in the comments below. Let us know where in the world you're listening from. Please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel for more stories like this. And feel free to share your thoughts on Caleb and Lenora's journey. Your support helps us keep these tales of the Old West alive.